Hello, everyone, and welcome to the George Engel Research Grand Rounds. I'll be doing introductions today for Steve. Today, we have a talk by Dr. Viji Kannan, PhD. Viji completed her PhD in Health Policy and Services Research at the University of Rochester. And since then, she's worked as a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Psychiatry on my own research team and has been studying early life social and psychological determinants of late life health outcomes like dementia and longevity. Her interests broadly include the policy and health economics of social inequalities, social processes associated with optimal aging, and determinants of social support in later life. She's published papers in Medical Care, the Journal of Psychiatric Research, and Social Science and Medicine, and has focused on cross-disciplinary collaborations throughout her entire career, including with health services researchers, psychologists, and mental health researchers, and with aging researchers. Today, she will be presenting a life course perspective on social engagement and discussing some of her recent work in the area. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to DJ.
Thank you, Ben. So let me get to my PowerPoint. And there we go. All right, thank you. So today I'm going to talk very broadly about social connectedness. There is a lot of research on social connectedness, so this talk will just touch on a small portion of that research to provide a bit of background. And using a life course approach, I'll discuss aspects of our social selves at different life stages, ultimately showing how earlier life stages influence social connectedness in later life stages. So the term social connectedness serves as an umbrella that encompasses various aspects of how individuals connect to or interact with each other. Primarily social isolation and social engagement draws on opposite ends of that spectrum. So social isolation does not mean that a person is constantly without the company of other people. It's not like being in solitary confinement. Instead, there are markers of isolation like living alone, having comparatively few social network ties, or infrequent social contact. And social engagement refers to social exposure broadly, where the nuances of that exposure depend on the study and how social engagement is measured in any particular study. So for example, you could measure the amount of time you spend with others, the number of people that you're able to confide in for important matters, how often you socialize, and with whom, like family, friends, or neighbors. So other related concepts include social capital, social network, social support, companionship, community involvement, and loneliness, each having their own distinct domain in social connectedness research. So although there are other social species, humans are referred to as the ultra-social animal, primarily because throughout human history, humans needed to be very cooperative to negotiate survival pressures. And this is illustrated in a series of comparisons contrasting chimpanzee groups to humans living in small-scale forager societies. So chimpanzees live together, chimpanzees travel together, chimpanzees forage together, but the actual consumption of anything gained from that foraging is done individually. Humans, on the other hand, are cooperative foragers. They share the food fairly among members of the group. In terms of possession, objects are possessed by whichever chimpanzee is holding it. Whereas humans in these foraging societies will recognize and respect other people's property. In terms of raising children, mothers provide almost 100% of their child's care in all 4 species of non-human great apes, whereas human mothers provide about 50% of the child care, and fathers, extended family, and other females will help with the remaining 50%. Communication is an important distinction that really shows human cooperativeness. Great apes use communication primarily to tell others what to do. By contrast, humans use communication to be helpful to others, to inform others about things that are important to the recipient. This motive to be helpful through the use of communication is even seen in human infants, where infants will use nonverbal pointing gestures to inform others, for example, something that they're excited about and want to share that information. Or if an adult shows distress because they're not able to find an object, infants and toddlers will point to help the adult find the missing object. So this cooperation and helpfulness was so important throughout human history that we feel a pain like an alarm when we're isolated, and we call this pain loneliness. And while being social was important in terms of ensuring survival of the species, being social continues to be important even today to our individual physical and mental health. So isolated individuals are at elevated risk for cardiovascular disease and stroke, infectious disease, disability, cognitive decline and dementia, anxious or depressed mood, and all-cause mortality, including suicidal ideation, suicidal attempts and completion, as well as opioid drug misuse and drug overdose deaths. Now, studying the association between social isolation and psychiatric disorders is a little tricky because their associations are often bidirectional. So poor mental health can lead to social isolation, and social isolation can lead to poor mental health. But using quantitative methods to correct for endogeneity, researchers do find that social isolation has strong effects on psychiatric disorders. And in comparison to well-known mortality risk factors like air pollution, physical activity, and smoking, social isolation is comparable to or even rivals these other well-known mortality risk factors in terms of prevalence and in terms of fatality or deadliness. So the impact on health, longevity, and quality of life, and the consequent toll on individuals and society is especially important given recent trends in the US. So this graph depicts the average number of minutes per day of social isolation in the US. Now, these minutes per day, and for all the trends in this presentation, do not include time spent asleep, working, or grooming, which is something like bathing or something like that. So the blue trend line shows the number of minutes per day along the y-axis spent alone without the company of anyone for each year from 2003 to 2020, which is shown along the x-axis. The thin black line is from a join point analysis. It shows the linear trend for certain segments of the trend line. And these segments are punctuated by join points, which indicate the year when the slope of the linear trend changed significantly. If you convert the minutes per day into hours per year for each year, in 2019, Americans experienced 146 more hours of social isolation than in 2003. And this 146-hour increase in social isolation, which occurred over the course of 17 years, was repeated over the course of 1 year between 2019 and 2020. The joint point analysis shows that the slope of the trend line changed significantly in 2018, but it looks like the slope change was pulled by the year 2020. So unsurprisingly, the pandemic exacerbated social isolation. Now, looking at social engagement across a few different relationship roles, we have here in-person social engagement with one's at-home family members, which was 122 hours less in 2019 than in 2003, and 61 hours more in 2020 than in 2019. Generally, social engagement with household family has been declining. This joint point analysis shows a straight linear downward trend with no joint points. So we've been steadily for almost a couple of decades spending less and less time with household family members, and the uptick during the pandemic really did nothing to offset that decline. So this is social engagement with non-household family, which declined by 43 hours between 2003 and 2019, and declined by 37 hours between 2019 and 2020. And the difference over time was relatively small compared to household family, and that's just because on average, people spend less time with non-household family than with household family. And here, once again, we see that the trend was influenced by the pandemic in 2020. So this is social engagement with friends, which also declined over time. 158 hours less in 2019 than in 2003, and 85 hours less in 2020 than in 2019. So the joint point at 2019 shows that there was a statistically significant change in the trend line brought on by 2020. You can see other joint points, but the slopes of those connected linear segments were far less steep than the last one from 2019 to 2020. So this graph shows social engagement with others over time, and others is just a catch-all that includes specifically roommates, neighbors, acquaintances, clients, and coworkers, but also includes other enumerated roles. So Americans spent 67 hours less in 2019 than in 2003, and 55 hours less in 2020 than in 2019, socially engaged with others. And a pretty steep decline was also brought on by the pandemic. So finally, this graph does not depict a relationship role, but rather a concept in social connectedness called companionship. And companionship is shared leisure for the sake of enjoyment. So it refers to socializing, relaxing, and leisure with other people. That is how you spend time with others. Companionship is associated with an intrinsic satisfaction that need not serve any extrinsic purpose like social support. And companionship declined by 122 hours between 2003 and 2019, and declined by 49 hours between 2019 and 2020. Now here, we do not see a join point indicating a statistically significant change in the slope due to the pandemic. Instead, the downward trend in companionship has been ongoing since 2012 and at a pace not eclipsed by the pandemic. So many social connectedness studies focus on older adults. Disengagement theory, activity and continuity theories, and socio-emotional selectivity theory. They all propose that there is a decline in social engagement in older adulthood, but these theories do not factor in aspects of the life course. To explain individual differences in lower social engagement or in older adulthood, So we're going to take a look at social connectedness through a life course perspective. So this is another graph of social isolation by age group, with the three oldest groups, those 65 and older in purples, 55 to 64-year-olds in orange, and 45 to 54-year-olds in green, showing the most amount of time in social isolation with increases in age. However, studies that focus on older adults only during older adulthood sort of obscure the dynamics of social connectedness over the entire life course, and taking a life course perspective is needed for contextualizing later life social connectedness. So the convoy model, on the other hand, suggests that the life course influences social connection in later life. It describes evolving social connections over one's lifetime, in which social experiences in older adulthood are a function of relational histories over the life course. So using the convoy model, research indicates that having close relationships with a variety of figures, the presence of multiple relationships that play diverse roles in children's lives, these people together appear to benefit children and adolescents and facilitate adaptation across various different domains of social experience. So social engagement life course trajectories show that the family network is stable in size from adolescence to old age. Coworker and neighbor social networks are important only in specific age ranges. The social network of close confidants who provide social support decreases throughout adulthood. Friendship networks also decrease throughout adulthood, and informal social participation decreases with age, while formal social participation increases, perhaps to compensate. The total social network increases up until young adulthood and then decreases steadily from there. So our social selves began long before older adulthood, and the dynamics of social connectedness evolve throughout the life course. And to explore this, we're going to take a little detour and look at what this means in terms of the human brain and in terms of children and adolescents. So as humans, we have large brains, larger brains than other species, but having a large brain is very costly because brains consume a great deal of energy. So large brains will only evolve if the benefits outweigh those energetic costs. The benefits of large brains can be explained by the demands of complex social systems that primates, especially humans, have. The term social brain refers to the network of brain regions that are involved in understanding other people. And the social brain does things like attach emotional value to faces. It also remembers all the relationships in a group, manipulates information about specific relationships, and represents someone else's representation of our own mental state, which is called second order representation. But the social brain hypothesis is not simply about the ability to remember social information, or even just to manipulate social information, or even emotional representation. But rather, the social brain is about the social skills required to manage social relationships. So for example, humans in foraging societies engage in practices like grooming cliques, which are essentially coalitions within a tribe or group. So sometimes members of your own group will engage in harassment or competition. And so coalitions allow people to protect themselves and each other from that harassment and competition, but without driving away those other members of the group. They want to make sure that those other members continue to provide defensive support, foraging support, and parenting support. that make groups of humans so necessary for survival. They need to be able to count on all members of the group for unsolicited, unwavering support when they need it, not only in necessary collaborative situations, but also outside of those situations, and not based on reciprocity. But they also need to be able to manage those unwanted behaviors from some group members. For altruism or helpfulness to be selected for, it should be reflexive. And from the time we are children, we reflexively exhibit altruism. And we see this play out in very young children. 1- and 2-year-old toddlers have been found to be intrinsically motivated to help other people almost indiscriminately. When young children are presented with an overtly distressed stranger, they show concern, they check up on the person, they try to help or share, they attend to the situation in some way. None of them just ignore the person. Infants as young as 14 months of age will help adults with all kinds of problems, from fetching out of reach objects to opening doors to stacking books, and importantly, with no concrete reward and with no difference between when others are or are not watching them or encouraging them, and with greater likelihood to share or help when having to do so quickly, in other words, reflexively. And they do this in a wide variety of contexts, and they also do it at some cost to themselves. For example, toddlers will provide a distressed adult with a resource that the child values for herself. Young children are equally satisfied when they help someone as when they see them being helped. And they're more satisfied in both of these cases than when the person is not being helped at all, suggesting intrinsic motivation and that a concern for self-reputation or reciprocity is not the motivation for young children's helping behavior. In fact, external rewards dampen helpfulness. When young children are given rewards, then those rewards are later taken away. Children's helping behavior actually goes down compared to children who are never rewarded in the first place. So these children aren't making any calculations. Prosociality was just selected for over time, and it was more likely to be selected the more reflexive it was. So moving farther along in the life course, adolescence is a sensitive period for adapting to the social environment. During adolescence, areas of the social brain undergo structural changes and functional reorganization. Adolescents experience changes hormonally, physically, psychologically, behaviorally, and socially. Adolescents go through a period of social reorienting where their social sphere is dominated by their peers. And adolescence is a time when people express greater vulnerability in response to rejection. And criticism by their peers really affect feelings of social and personal worth. Adolescence is a period of heightened sensitivity to sociocultural signals. In fact, rejection or exclusion is felt most profoundly during adolescence. So it seems that our social development is shaped in large part due to friends and peers during adolescence. And looking at trends over time by age, the blue line here is 15 to 24-year-olds. And these graphs show a steady decline among 15 to 24-year-olds in social engagement with friends and in companionship, which which are the social foci for the social focus for adolescents, their friends' peer group, and socializing and leisure activities. And so as this cohort ages into mid and late life adults, the social convoy model would suggest that this trend might have implications in terms of their capacity to lead fulfilling social lives. Okay. Now we're going to consider aspects of adolescence that can have long-reaching effects on social engagement well into adulthood and older adulthood. So different types of high school activities are associated with greater social activity decades later in midlife and later life. And this is where we start to show that there are factors that contribute to individual differences in how relational histories develop over the life course. So, for example, involvement in sports, performance arts like drama or orchestra, pep squad, student government, publications like student newspaper and yearbook, doing service projects, and assisting in school administration all impact older adult social engagement. And here, I will talk about two specific aspects of adolescent life: leisure reading and parental social capital that could impact later life social engagement. So literary theories link leisure reading to prosociality and social cognitive skills through conceptual frameworks of transportation and simulation. So according to these theories, leisure reading builds prosocial skills by fusing attention, imagery, and feeling, which emotionally transports readers into the story. So once transported, readers immerse themselves in a variety of social situations. Readers are able to vicariously experience many different emotions through many different characters, each with their own unique desires and motivations. So these simulations allow the reader to privately develop and train prosocial and social cognitive skills within a safe simulated social encounter. And when readers return to the real world, they put their books down and go out into the real world, readers are subtly transformed by those simulations. And these literary theories are supported by empirical evidence. So reading has been shown to promote prosociality and social cognition. A 2016 meta-analysis found that greater fiction and or nonfiction reading was related to higher scores on social cognitive measures of empathy, theory of mind, and perspective taking. In experimental studies, lifetime and concurrent fiction reading were both found to be associated with higher tendencies toward prosocial helping behaviors. Also, lifetime fiction reading was found to be associated with higher sensitivity to nonverbal social cues. So since prosociality facilitates social engagement, and reading, which increases prosociality, should also increase the likelihood on average of social engagement. So that forms sort of the premise of a study that I'm currently working on. And I'll share the findings from that. Essentially, the premise of the study is that reading should increase social engagement, and it should do so, at least in part through prosociality. So during adolescence, concurrent analysis of reading and social engagement mediated by prosociality. And so what we found was that although adolescent reading has a positive association with adolescent prosociality, and adolescent prosociality has a positive association with adolescent social engagement, adolescent reading has a negative association with adolescent social engagement, nonetheless. So the relationship between reading and social engagement in adolescence in this model is carried out entirely through prosociality. And one could argue that leisure reading takes time away from other leisure activities, including social engagement. And also, especially in adolescence, avid readers may seem nerdy and may not have as much social currency, during that life stage than readers would have at other life stages. So by contrast, concurrent analysis in older adulthood shows no significant association between reading and prosociality. This might be why there aren't any published articles about this relationship for older ages. And it might be that adolescence is a sensitive period when the influence of reading takes effect on prosociality. But in older adulthood, reading does have a significant and positive association with social engagement. It's just not mediated by prosociality. And looking over the life course, reading in adolescence is positively related to social engagement in older adulthood. And this relationship is partially mediated by reading in older adulthood and prosociality in older adulthood. In our findings, these mediators only explain 1/4 to 1/3 of the total effect of adolescent reading on older adult social engagement. So there are likely to be other mediators that carry the effect from adolescent reading to older adult social engagement. So that's another thing for another study to kind of parse out. So now let's switch and take a look at parental social capital. So children observe their parents modeling certain behaviors, and from their parental modeling, those children easily develop behavioral tendencies based on their parents' behavior. So like smoking, exercising, drinking, studying, and even moods and emotions like fear, anxiety, and anger. Parents who engage in community activities have to navigate social intricacies, which requires at least some amount of social skill and enthusiasm for social exposure. And studies have shown that the children of parents who participate in community activities have lower rates of criminality, a stronger sense of connection to the community, and greater involvement in school and community extracurricular activities. So when parents engage in community activities, children are able to observe the behaviors necessary to do well in a social environment. Parents engaged with the community are also building their social capital, and their children may themselves have a greater sense of community, which leads to more social connectedness. So this is the premise of a project that I've only started on, but I'll share the preliminary results with you. So looking over the life course, so we're looking at how parents' community involvement is associated with a variety of social connectedness measures over 3 different stages. So looking over the life course, we see that parental social involvement in the community during adolescence has statistically significant and positive associations with various social connected measures over in terms of number and variety of extracurriculars, participation in sports, and a social life index that captures how many times they're able to go out in the evening, go out and spend time with friends, how many people they date, how long they've dated people, just a variety of high school type of social life factors are incorporated in this social life index. So also in middle adulthood, which is early to mid 30s, in terms of relationship satisfaction with a significant other, with parents, with other relatives, and with friends, and with socializing in general. So how satisfied people are in their middle adulthood. These also show positive and statistically significant associations with their parents' community engagement during adolescence. And in older adulthood, this is the late 60s to early 70s. In terms of taking steps to be with friends and in terms of participating in the community themselves, our results also show a positive and statistically significant association, once again, with their parents' community engagement during their adolescence. Now, it's important to note that in this analysis, we don't have the same social connectedness measures across all 3 life stages, because in the data, none of these measures were repeated. So we can't show sort of like a continuity for one particular measure, but we're just showing that broadly, these different measures of social connectedness have a positive association with parents' social community engagement during adolescence, which in part is likely to be due to heritability. So that's something to consider, but evidence also exists that, especially in adolescence, showing that the social environment plays an important role and that parents' social participation influences various aspects of their child's behavior. So given the impact on health, longevity, and quality of life, and the consequent toll on individuals and society, and the downward trend in social connectedness for almost 2 decades, there have been a wide range of interventions designed to reduce social isolation and to promote social engagement. So at the individual level, interventions have tried to facilitate social bonding by improving participants' interpersonal communication skills, by providing regular social contact or companionship, by creating a social opportunity that didn't exist before, that might be more accessible to otherwise isolated individuals, perhaps like volunteering opportunities, activities that gather people for a like purpose, like gardening programs, computer skills courses, or sports. And some people believe that they're going to be rejected by others, or that they're unlovable. So remedying those beliefs that are holding them back, as well as social cognitive training. So reviews of individual level interventions to reduce isolation find that many interventions have some element of success. However, effects were generally not long lasting. Essentially, the reviews of individual level interventions are mixed. So researchers have proposed looking at the other end of the socio-ecological model of health, especially with the understanding that various aspects of early life, childhood through adolescence, influence later life social connectedness. So policies are an intervention that people live under their whole lives, starting in childhood. Policy is often a preventative method for addressing thorny public health issues. For example, excise taxes and smoke-free air laws work to prevent or reduce tobacco use at all stages of the risk trajectory. Whereas trying to get someone to quit smoking who is already addicted and smokes 2 packs a day is less effective for improving population health than preventing the public health hazard to begin with. So public policy might be applied to improving social connectedness and reducing social isolation. And having a public policy in place can catch people at all points in the social connectedness risk trajectory and could potentially impact the health outcomes associated with social isolation more directly. So if a socially isolated person who has been socially isolated for years or decades has a heart attack and then subsequently receives therapy that includes social support, the conditions are already set for cardiovascular disease and for all of the ensuing health problems after the heart attack. But having policies in place should help catch the social health deficits before they become problems. So here is a list of policy domains to address social connectedness. And I will briefly describe 4 of them. So starting with housing, one of the proposed policies for addressing social connectedness in housing includes policies to ban architectural exclusion. And architectural exclusion are just walled off neighborhoods that occur in many cities. Detroit has a prime example. And they're generated over time by local ordinances, and primarily they segregate minority communities into literal physical spaces that have literal walls around them. So work, recent labor strikes have centered around long work hours and mandatory overtime. We saw this in the Kellogg's warehouse strike. Labor disputes have also cited lack of paid family leave, which we see in the current railroad negotiations. And interviews of workers, the workers will cite difficulties in meaningful relationships. Like they can't get home to see their family, they can't have time to socialize with their friends. And this makes up one of the primary reasons for why they're striking. And Vivek Murthy, who is the Surgeon General and was the Surgeon General in a previous administration, he stated that excessive work hours contributes to social isolation, and it's something that policymakers should take a look at. So policies like paid family leave, flexible schedules, living wages, so people don't have to work multiple jobs, 60 or 80 hours a week. Those are work policies that might help. Nutrition, the Older Americans Act has programs like Meals on Wheels that brings community to otherwise housebound older adults. And they have congregate dining, which brings older adults together in one place for meals. Other nutrition-related policies include local community gardens, farmers markets. These are all nutrition policy initiatives that can help with connectedness as sort of a side effect. The environment includes built environment policies, parks and green spaces, sidewalks, or just walkable communities. Also policies that reduce air pollution so people feel comfortable going outside together. And all told, all of the policies I mentioned are rational and what you would expect, but they have to overcome budget constraints and inertia, as with all other policies. But establishing a framework like this and working on it with researchers, scientists, and policymakers is an important step toward hopefully eventually seeing action take place. So I'm going to end with thank you. I will take your questions. And also I have my email here if anybody wants to contact me for any reason about this presentation.
Okay, thank you, Viji. I'll be standing in for Steve today to handle the Q&A. One thing to note before we get started, there's an evaluation link in the chat, so please don't forget to fill out your evaluation, and I'm told there will be a separate email going out tomorrow. So please get us that evaluation when time permits. Okay, so I am going to look here into the Q&A chat. And I'm actually not seeing any questions. So if you do have anything, go ahead and speak up. I will start out with one that I see we have one, and Elliot Spengler. We're going to get to you in just a second. One quick question I have, BJ, is the early graphs you showed, the time series of changes in social participation. I'm struck by the increase in internet use and social media use that also occurred during that time. Did you run into anything, in your work that referenced, secular trends in increasing social media use and paradoxically greater social isolation?
Yes, so there are a couple of papers on that with regard to adolescents, especially. So what hopefully the graphs that I showed and looking at, so the graphs that I showed, I think I pointed out are in person. It says in person time. And to sort of get an understanding of how much of a complement or a substitute, because there's that conversation that, and this is mostly once again for the youth, anywhere between teenagers to, early mid 20s, that it could actually be a complement, that the use of social, even texting or the use of social media is done in person sometimes, but mostly to set up in-person conversations or in-person engagement. So it's, I think, useful to have the slides that show, the graphs that show what is the actual in-person trend, and then along with what is any sort of mediated trend to show how much of a complement or a substitute that is. But yeah, other researchers definitely, and I can get anybody who's interested, I have those articles that are looking at youth and their time spent on mediated technology.
Okay, and so, interestingly, Elliot Spengler's question, which I didn't even see before I asked mine, says, what has research shown about technology use amongst adolescents and social
and it's gone up. Yeah, I guess I didn't really.
So sorry, yeah. Elliot, I didn't mean to steal your thunder there. And I have a note that someone wants to answer this question live. Not sure if I can do anything to facilitate that. I just see a little microphone in the chat. Well, let me move on real quick because another question has popped up in the chat. And it's this from Eric. He says, many of the policy changes implied by your presentation are intensely political, and the current healthcare system absorbs much of the nation's social spending. So how would you foresee dealing with the political nature of those policy changes and their costs, which is what I believe you're getting at, Eric?
Yeah, so I would just say that all policy is very political. But if you're looking at today's climate, just everything is very political. And so that's, a navigation that policymakers and people in the academic community who do that kind of research, like how are you going to get this actually accomplished, have to deliberate. And I think that a lot of, when we think about the academic community as a whole, you think about economists and sociologists and political scientists, there's always a perspective. So an economist, whether they're macro or micro, their objective or goal might be to have, the greatest amount of national wealth, however it's distributed, or their goal might be efficiency, however they're measuring efficiency in their particular study. So I think if you're coming from a public health perspective, it's okay to have the perspective or the goal of, we want the greatest amount of health for the greatest number of people at the least expense to anybody. And that includes, all groups of people. So you start from a goal and then you sort of figure out, by evidence-based research that's out there, what do we know that can accomplish this goal? And then you have open dialogue with everyone else.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that. And certainly, I think many people out there are I don't want to say nihilist in terms of accomplishing certain things politically, but we all understand that perspective. So Eric, your point's well taken. Very, very difficult to get everybody on a common page with some of these policies. Let me see if there are any more questions here.
We can
okay.
also.
Oh, go ahead, please.
We can also poll the room really quickly. Do we have any questions in the room?
Okay. Please correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not seeing anybody. So, okay. So going once, going twice. Oh, here, someone, we just had something popped up. Okay, so this is from Brian Davidson. Isn't an emphasis on societal policy change and underappreciation of the role of the nuclear family, particularly given your findings on the influence of parental social engagement? So you want to take a crack at that, Viji?
Yeah, I think we can have both. We can have an appreciation for all the individual level factors that will contribute to social connectedness or social isolation, as well as considering how we make the broader social context amenable to high levels of social connectedness. So if you only, sometimes certain individual level factors can be more easily achieved by certain groups and less easily achieved by other groups. And when you take tobacco as an example, there have been the excise taxes, the smoke-free air laws. We were able to get the tobacco settlement, which brought in a lot of money. And that was, even though it was through the courts, that was essentially a policy. And then that money is also being used for individual level interventions. So you don't want to divorce the two. You can't have, there's no reason to think that you have one or the other. They both work synergistically. And a lot of the sort of looking at trends really helps you look at how you can apply both together.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, and yes, intervention at different levels. It's a very good point. It's always difficult to know, at what level to expend what resources and how can we get them all to work together. So, very good question.
And just to go on with the family specifically, that might just include, so you look at the results and you might want to do individual level interventions at the family, and then also think about how policy can rope the family together as well into an intervention. at that level.
Absolutely. So, okay, so we're, 2 minutes shy of one. So, seeing no other questions, I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up for us. Viji, I'd like to thank you for presenting today, and
Thank you.
would like to remind everyone also about the evaluation link in the chat and the email that'll be coming out. And we appreciate your time today. And with that, I'll go ahead and sign off.